In this tutorial, I wanted to provide an overview about how backup sets relate to providers in Holland. So I've pulled up a diagram that's available on the wiki to sort of outline this, and you can see that there's three major sections. Holland Core Framework, solid box is the actual providers, and this dotted box is the backup sets. The Core Framework really represents things that might be shared by multiple providers, things like how to connect to MySQL or another database platform, compression modules that you can use, things of that sort. Then we have the actual providers themselves, which provide a backup service. I've highlighted two here, which is also the two that really should be used in production. Some of these others are really still in development or more proof of concepts. MySQL Dump and MySQL LVM. Now in the backup sets section, I have basically 5 backup sets, 3 for MySQL Dump, 2 for LVM. The interesting thing is that these can be configured completely separate from each other. So transactional DBs in this example might be connecting to a remote database, StatsDB might be doing aggressive table filtering, things along those lines. Now what that looks like on the server is basically this. I'm in the SE Holland directory, and if you look, you can see there are 3 major sections we're going to talk about today. One is the main Holland config, and I'm really only going to highlight one section here, which is backup sets. Backup sets are used whenever you're invoking Holland with the BK command and not specifying any backup sets on the command line. So this would be good if you have a nightly database backup that might be covering multiple backup sets and you want them all backed up in sort of one go. You would set that here. Now this providers directory essentially has configuration files which you really can think of as global defaults. So if we look at MySQL Dump, you can see the default is to use gzip, inline compression, and to specify a level of 1. That means if I don't actually have a compression section in my own backup set, it's going to inherit from this. You can also look at lock methods. Right, and I might want to set that, for example, to something else other than auto detect. Okay, I might want to set it to single transaction if I know what I'm doing and I want to force single transaction backups, even if Holland thinks that's not the best course of action. So again, the nice thing is that anything you put here, you don't have to put in your backup sets that actually implement this provider. For the most part, though, you probably aren't going to need to do that if you have a small number of backup sets. And if you do, I actually recommend making those backup sets more explicit so that someone else looking at that config file has a better idea about what's going on. Now, in this backup sets directory is where the actual sort of magic happens in regards to how backups work, because each of these config files represents a backup set. If we look at default.conf, we can see I've intentionally stripped away comments here, so it's probably not a very good example of a good backup set to use, but I did that on purpose because I wanted to highlight 2 sections, and these are largely global sections that most providers are going to use. One is a Holland backup section, which tells Holland what provider you're going to use. In this case, plugin is synonymous with provider, how many backups on the server I want to keep, and the estimated size factor for each backup. Holland is able to basically do disk-based calculations, so and the accuracy depends on whatever provider you're using. But essentially, Holland's going to come up with a number that it thinks is the amount of disk space you need to actually complete that backup. Estimated size factor allows you to override that, which makes a lot of sense if you're doing compression and you know that you're going to get a good compression level. And the great thing about it is that you can always look that up just simply by running a Holland backup and seeing the amount of space that it found and the actual amount of space that's consumed in the backup. There's this compression section, speaking of, that allow you to configure different compression methods, and a lot of providers are likely going to share this same section as well. So right now I'm using gzip with inline compression, which is generally recommended in almost all cases with a level of 1, so I'm using fast compression. Just on that note, you could use something like LZOP or bzip2 or anything like that. The level is specific to the level of those compression agents. So if you're using LZOP, specifying a level of 3 might be different than if you're using gzip and specifying a level of 3. Now if we look at MySQL LVM, show you a little bit of difference there. You can see I still have a Holland backup section. I'm keeping 1 backup. I'm setting 1x for my size factor, and I'm using MySQL LVM. You can see here that I have a MySQL LVM section, so that was different. Now I also added a MySQL client section. At least for the providers using MySQL, you may have this section. You may want to define it because this is where you can do things like configure Holland to log into a remote database server and do a backup that way, or specify a specific username and password or socket, things along those lines. Okay, so that's a quick overview about basically how backup sets work and sort of what is shared between most backup sets. Another nice little feature is generating backups. So if you run Holland mkconfig, you can get a little description about what it actually does. All you really need to do is specify a provider, say MySQL backup, MySQL dump. And what it's going to do is going to output to standard out a config file that you can use to sort of start a backup. It's kind of like a default. The neat thing is that's not too special, although that's kind of convenient, but you can also pass it the edit flag. So if I wanted to create a MySQL dump backup set, but I already knew what kind of settings I wanted to add to it, I can go ahead and run that command. It's going to invoke the whatever editor is defined in the system, and I can actually change some of these variables. So I might want to change, dump events to true if I'm running MySQL 5.1. Okay, and then I can actually save that file to whatever I want. Okay. All right. Now there's other ways to do this too. If you don't like using that command for whatever reason, there is an examples directory. It's going to have fairly well commented example config files, and for the most part you can use these to just copy over to the backup sets directory and start your basic backup. But if you want to know kind of what settings do and you don't want to have to go online to look at the documentation, you could look at some of these example files, and it might help you kind of decide what you actually want to do with some of these settings. So that's how essentially backup sets work. To see where they go, if you go to varspool Holland, that's the default backup location, you can see that for each backup set that I've run, there's a backup directory. So if we go into default, for example, if you remember, my backups to keep was set to 7, so if I'd run more than that, you would see up to 7 backup sets here. Now each of these backup sets is going to be or directories is going to be specific to whatever provider I'm actually using. In this case, since I'm using MySQL dump, here's sort of what you would typically see. This backup data directory is going to have one or more actual database dumps. Because I'm using file per data, or I'm not using file per database, rather, I set it to no, I only have one backup file there. Now this myCNF is actually used when Holland runs a backup. It passes that myCNF as a defaults file to MySQL dump. And that's really nice because if you're doing very aggressive database and table filtering, it's a lot easier to put that in a config file and reference it as opposed to trying to put it on the command line. It makes debugging easier as well. Now you have this backup config file, which is roughly similar to the backup set config file. And the reason we have that is that if you're ever doing a restore and you didn't have that file in the system, Holland can still use this to know basically how things are configured. Now, at the time of this video, we don't have a restore framework, so that's really more of a future thing. But it's also helpful to look when you're actually doing a restore what was configured when that backup actually took place. Now, one more thing I wanted to show you is actually how to run a backup. And you can see I did not define any backup sets in holland.conf, so if I don't specify anything, it's not going to let me actually do a backup. So I'm going to go ahead and specify my default backup set. And I wanted to outline two things. One was this final on disk backup size. You can see it's basically 9% of what it thought I needed when it estimated about 18 megabytes, only used about 1.7. So given this, you might think that I'd want to set estimated size factor to 0.10. In reality, though, you'll probably want to set that to something a little bit larger, like 15-20%, just to account for your data set changing and database growth. You're not always going to get that exact compression in the future, for example, so you want to allow for that. You can also see that here's that defaults file section I was referring to a little bit earlier. Right? And this is the backup expiration policy. It says it found 3 backups and it's keeping up to 7. A quick note on that is that Holland currently uses a conservative backup approach. So it's only going to purge out backups on the next successful completion of your backup. It's kind of important to know because if Holland's ever broken or can't connect to MySQL or anything like that, it will not actually purge your old backups. We did that on purpose so that you had at least some backup on the server as opposed to no backup. In future Holland releases, we might be changing that policy a little bit so that you can define whether or not you want to keep backups before the next backup runs, and that way you can save some space if you have a very large database. In any case, that basically covers it. Just real quick, if you had any questions about how all this stuff works, you can certainly go to the wiki, hollandbackup.org, and you can also jump up on our mailing list, specifically our development mailing list. That's where we do talk about development things in Holland, but you can also use that to ask some questions, and particularly if you think you found a Holland bug or you're not really sure about what's going on, feel free to use that resource and we'd be happy to help. So with that in mind, thank you for listening.